so lucky to get to be here with an old friend of mine, Malcolm Gladwell. And we're going to talk about what making this podcast sort of meant to him. And then he's going to render for you the final episode of the first season of Revisionist History. Podcasts are clearly this extraordinary form, and Malcolm's a master of it after only one season. So we're going to have a quick question and answer, and then he's going to do the last episode. Thanks. Here he is, Malcolm Gladwell. Hi.
Hi, Virginia.
I'm excited. Okay, so without knowing anything about this final episode, I want to ask you first about podcasting generally, because when I first met you, I was a fact checker, and you were a writer, and we did not think about our voices and our hair and how we sat on stage. You just thought about reporting and how to put a story together. And somehow you had to become a radio personality and use your voice. Why switching to audio? Did you gargle? Do you do freeing the inner voice exercises like actors?
Well, there's a moment of insecurity when you wonder whether you're one of those people who has an interesting voice or not. Because the minute you do something that's about audio, you instantly realize that you have been consciously or unconsciously judging everyone you've heard on the radio according to their voice, right? You have a set of prejudices. Actually, I can't stand listening to that person. Actually, I can. I really want to listen to that person. Mm-hmm. And you divided up the world into the unlistenables and the very listenables. And then your first thought is, oh my God, am I part of the unlistenables?
Yes. And so what would be...
Who's an unlistenable?
Yeah.
Do I have to name names?
Well, let's say what style? What style?
Well, my father once gave me this long riff about, for some reason he got really interested in voices. And there's a technical explanation for what makes an interesting voice.
Oh.
Which has to do, and I can't even remember, he gave me this whole thing once. But I think it has to do with, you obviously want some degree of variety.
Yeah.
And you want, what I like is idiosyncrasy. So I want someone who tells me something in their intonation and pacing and emotion that's not present in the words.
Yes.
And I don't really care what it is. I just want another layer.
Yeah. Yes. And you do that.
I do that.
On the way, I was going to mention to you, I think when Walter Cronkite died, I listened to a lot of his broadcasts. And he has this sort of pre-Peter Jennings, your fellow Canadian, there was a way of announcing the news in this very moralistic way. So I remember there was one broadcast where he says, the youth of today are very involved with drugs and alcohol. And, you knew what he thought.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's a very clinical Peter Jennings way where he would say, like, they were having three-ways and using tentacles porn. Where, like, no judgment, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so, but you do something different. I have an idea of what that is, but what do you think you do?
I don't know that I do anything at all. Do I?
I think you add not clinical, not moral judgment, but something like irony. Does anyone agree?
In the way that I sort of take certain positions or not. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's... I don't think I'm doing it consciously, but there's a thing where there's this huge difference between reading something that you wrote and reading something that someone else wrote. So it's very difficult if you think of an actor in a movie and they're doing someone else's lines and they have to inhabit someone else's words with whatever character they're playing. And that's complicated. But if it's your own words, as you're reading them, you're revisiting how you felt when you were writing them. And, as you know, the process of writing is a series of in-jokes, right? You write something and you have your own private experience. Something like when I was at the Washington Post years ago, we used to have contests to get phrases into the Washington Post.
This story, and
which
nobody did this.
This is an extreme version of the private joke, which is you always like there's always a separate kind of reality to what you're writing that is specific to you and your experience. So, your father will use your mother will use some phrase, and so you throw it into a story, and every time you see it, you kind of...
Yeah.
So when you're reading it, you're reliving all of that, and it's coming out in the way you talk in a way that you're not necessarily consciously aware of.
Yes. Yes.
And then also your emotions surface. So in the episode that airs tomorrow, it's a real weeper, and there's this guy. It's all about this guy, this 98-year-old Mennonite pastor, who is one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. And the whole time I was interviewing him, I was essentially on the verge of tears. And so I can't, when I do the whole episode, I am reliving that moment when I'm sitting in his living room, almost trying to hold it together.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, I think that's what you pick up. That's the benefit of reading your own words.
I've noticed that other podcasters have experimented with describing in advance their own voice when you hear it in the interview. So like, I'm a little choked up here. I'm a little overexcited here in this interview. In other words, like, I'm not a perfectly clinically detached person when I'm reporting.
Yeah.
You know? I think on Serial she does that. You know, she's like, look at how close I think I am to getting the answer here. I'm obviously like hyped up, you know? And then you hear her
Well, there is a whole, there was a whole kind of meta level to that.
Yes.
That kind of podcasting. It's impossible not to do that a little, but you know, I didn't want to sound like I was part of the Ira Glass school. I mean, I love the Ira Glass school.
Don't get me wrong.
Don't get me wrong. But I mean, I don't want to be I wanted to do something a little different.
So the irony that I notice, and since I haven't seen the scripts, you know, do you all remember in the Toyota episode, Malcolm talks about car guys. So I think if Walter Cronkite had done it, he might have been like the auto man or auto crowd. Like he sort of would have been down with them. And I think Peter Jennings, and I may be forcing this, would have said like an automobile expert, you know, but car guy. And I heard quotation marks around car guy when you said it, and then you identify with car guys.
Well, no, I love the car guys. I want to be a car guy, but I don't actually believe in my heart of hearts I'm a car guy. In other words, I'm fronting as a car guy, but I used to think I was more of one, but I have this little cousin who is 25, and he is both an airline pilot and a race car driver. He's the coolest guy who ever lived.
Yeah.
And ever since he became those two things, I feel so unworthy of calling myself a car guy. And he borrowed my Volkswagen Golf and took it up to some extraordinary speed on the Cross Bronx and reported back to me like how the car behaved at 110 or whatever. And I was just so humbled. And so I think I don't have the self-confidence now to really call myself a car guy in the wake of my cousin Jeremy's.
I think it's worth listening. We should like make a GIF of it, of audio GIF, of you just saying car guy, because I think all that history plays into
is
how you put that English on the word.
Yeah.
Words,
well, no, this is what we're talking about. This notion of another layer embedded in, and it's also the problem with when people. I think if I had to put into words what I classify, so we were talking about listenable versus unlistenable voices.
Yeah.
The unlistenable voices are the voices where the person is making no attempt to differentiate themselves from their kind of class, right? They're not doing, so they're not putting any of themselves into it. They are kind of falling back on their kind of group talk.
Yes.
And that's disappointing in a certain way because you want more, right? You want some idiosyncrasy or
pain or self. The thing that I would like to hear is I'd like to hear people in podcasts mispronounce foreign names, because it's just this lie of podcasting and audiobooks. So I recorded my audiobook and they said, just read it exactly the way you'd read it, except we're going to train you for 15 minutes on Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So that but that's exactly not, I would not get that right.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I can't just become this perfect BBC person right when I get up to the name and express no anxiety about diving into the name. You're just supposed to be this person that moves freely, in between ebonics and it just that seems like a little bit of virtuosity that's false.
I think the promise, someone said that podcasting right now is in a state that radio was in the 20s, where there was this extraordinary profusion of radio stations. And of course, what happens is you get consolidation, not just marketplace consolidation, but you also get cultural consolidation. So what arises is a series of, for example, voices that are appropriate for the radio. And I sort of feel that's the beginning of the end of radio. Like, and I think that podcasting ought to fight that kind of cultural consolidation, and we should continue to have, let a million flowers bloom. I'm reminded of, there was a kind of, in Toronto in the 80s, there was a kind of new wave station called, if I'm not mistaken, CFNY. Is anyone from Toronto? Is it CFNY? Am I right? Oh, you're too young for that. But CFNY, late night CFNY was, all the hosts were the most bizarre group of ill-suited radio voices you've ever, people with overwhelming speech defects, people with, and it was fantastic. It was like they were just there because they were into the latest, members album from England, and they would play it for you at great length. And that was magical. And now when I go home and I turn on CFNY, it's the same, it's that voice that went to, journalism school, and it it breaks my heart.
Communications degrees.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is amazing, like in the convention coverage, just that on television at least, there's no setting for just like, what did we just hear? There's no no one can be just like have just like revulsion or like I'm storming off the set kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, Virginia, that may still happen. There's just 96 days left before the election. I think
You're right.
There's plenty of time for revulsion yet to come.
Yeah.
Wait, I think we should start.
We should move. Yeah.
So, no, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to read this last episode, and then I'm going to pause 3/4 of the way through. Virginia and I are going to talk a little bit more. Then I'm going to finish, and then we're going to have audience Q&A, if you're all down with that. Okay.
That's a great format.
It's a great format. I'm going to start. So this is, I'm going to stand. This is the last episode of the first season. Oh, yeah. So how does this start? It
was sort of the middle of the 80s, and Mrs. Thatcher was the Prime Minister here, and she was very popular with the sort of working classes and things, and not with the sort of lefty middle classes like me.
Harry Enfield, one of England's best-known comedians. He's talking about where he got the inspiration for his most famous character, a response to the imperious Margaret Thatcher with her bob and pearls, who unleashed American-style capitalism on the UK.
And we, the sort of student hippies, we used to live on this council estate in Hackney, and we used to go to the local pub, and all the local sort of tradesmen and things always had huge wads of money, and they'd take it out, and because they thought we were squatters. We weren't actually squatters, but we looked like squatters because we worked in television. So they get their big wads of money out and sort of, flash it at the bar and everything.
Enfield hated Thatcher, hated what she represented.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Enfield and his partner Paul Whitehorse dreamt up a character to embody Thatcher's England.
So we'd start talking about this, and Paul Whitehouse was a plasterer at the time, my partner, and it sort of just became this sort of thing, really, where we just go loads of money about everything. Well, that's loads of money, that, loads of money, that. And then it became a sort of phenomenon.
His name was Loads of Money. He was a construction worker, catapulted to sudden delirious wealth by the 80s building boom. He chews gum with his mouth open, wears acid-wash jeans, white trainers, a yellow and green nylon jacket with white sleeves, keys on the belt, drives a white convertible in the countryside, all performed with a kind of cheerful, unstoppable tastelessness.
I'm into politics, right? All you need to know about politics is that Mrs. Thatcher done a lot of good for the country, but you wouldn't want to shag it. That's all.
I mean, at the time, everyone was going, Mrs. Thatcher this, Mrs. Thatcher that, and, sort of very obviously preaching to the converted. So we sort of did it the other way, which is just to go, look at me, aren't I great? Isn't money great? Everything else is rubbish. Only money is good.
I want to talk about satire, political satire. We live in the golden age of satire. It's almost to the point where we seem to conduct as much of our political conversation through humor as through the normal media. Remember Stephen Colbert at the 2006 White House Correspondents' Dinner? In character, as the conservative talk show host he was playing on television, he stands up and he gives a satirical toast to his quote-unquote hero, President George W. Bush.
I stand by this man. I stand by this man because he stands for things. Not only for things, he stands on things. Things like aircraft carriers and rubble and recently flooded city squares. And that sends a strong message that no matter what happens to America, she will always rebound with the most powerfully staged photo ops in the world.
All the while, President Bush sits unhappily on the dais a few feet from Colbert, squirming and grimacing and looking like he'd rather be 100 feet underground. It was a moment of comic genius. Then there was Tina Fey's devastating impression of Sarah Palin during the 2008 campaign when the Alaskan governor ran on the Republican presidential ticket with John McCain.
Well, Alaska and Russia are only separated by a narrow maritime border. You've got Alaska here, and this right here is water, and then that's up there's Russia. So we keep an eye on them.
Who do you remember now? Sarah Palin herself or Tina Fey's Palin? I've written opinion pieces for newspapers or magazines, and there you have to write in somber, reasonable tones. You're limited. Satire allows you to say almost anything. That's where truth is spoken to power in our society. When you sugarcoat a bitter truth with humor, it makes the medicine go down. Your audience lets its guard down. Just look at the way Saturday Night Live has covered Hillary Clinton. They've ruthlessly zeroed in on her ambition, her humorlessness, her severity, her opportunism, all the things that have always given people pause about her.
You're finally going to announce that you're running for president.
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I have it in me. I'm scared. I'm kidding. Let's do this.
Oh, Hillary, you put the hill in hilarious.
Comedians have become our truth tellers, and that's what Loads of Money was trying to do. Enfield wanted to tell the truth about what was happening in England after Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. She was the British Ronald Reagan. During her 11-year reign, she took on English socialism with a vengeance, called it a nanny state. Her aggression angered and scared a lot of people who felt that something fundamental about the country's character was being upended, that something dark and crude had been unearthed, something like Loads of Money.
All he did was have money, shag birds, drink, go to the opera. That was it, kind of thing.
Wait, I didn't realize he went to the opera.
Well, he didn't really like the opera, but he liked it because it was expensive. So he liked to be seen there, you know. So he'd go up to the bar and flash his wad, you know, and order champagne top, which is basically like lager top is a very big drink over here, which is lager with a bit of lime in the top. It's something you might get your girlfriend in the pub. So he'd go to the opera and order, you know, a pint of champagne top to keep it going, keep his girlfriend going.
Loads of Money ran in the mid-1980s on a popular Friday night sketch comedy show on British television. It struck a nerve. The first couple of times you do this sketch, is the reaction immediate or is it kind of build?
No, it's absolutely immediate. I mean, it was a sort of live show, and so it needed sort of big, brash, loud characters, and this was one. And people absolutely got it straight away.
It's hard to find someone over the age of 30 in England who doesn't remember the Loads of Money theme song. Enfield released it as a lark in 1988, and it was huge. Rose to number 2 in the British pop charts. The video is a series of shots of Loads of Money marching around with scantily dressed women, driving fancy cars, and sneering at the rest of the world, all the while waving huge piles of pound notes. It has 3.3 million views on YouTube.
Arno, ich laute Money.
There is no op-ed, no letter to the editor, no impassioned essay that gets 3.3 million views on YouTube. That's the power of satire. It can go places that serious discourse cannot. But here's the strange thing. If you ask Harry Enfield about Loads of Money's legacy, about what he thinks he accomplished by speaking truth so boldly to power, you know what he says? He says it made no difference. And that's what I want to talk about. Let's call it the Loads of Money problem.
You know, I mean, it's great fun to do, but generally, you know, it's just about questioning what's there because we're allowed to question what's there, so we do. But it doesn't ever change anyone's mind.
When Harry Enfield told me he didn't think Loads of Money made any difference, the first person I thought about was Stephen Colbert. Not the straight Stephen Colbert of the current Late Show, but his breakout character, the parody of a right-wing journalist that Colbert played on Comedy Central, first on The Daily Show and then from 2005 to 2014 on The Colbert Report. Colbert was trying to do a version of what Loads of Money was doing, shine a light on something crude in American popular culture. But you know, I was a guest on The Colbert Show a few times when I was promoting my books, and I have to say that there was always something a bit, maybe ambiguous is the right word, about Colbert's satire. You go to the studios, they're in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan, far west side. You sit in the green room beforehand, and Colbert comes in to say hello. He's not in character. He's this warm, charming, nice guy, and I can't stress the nice part enough. Everyone who meets Stephen Colbert thinks he's nice. He chats with you, and he warns you that when you go on set, he's going to be someone else, but you don't quite believe him because you see this really nice guy in front of you. Then you get on stage, and he really is someone else. He's now this aggressive, right-wing talk show host.
Okay, I'll get straight to my problem with this. Okay?
Yeah.
You know I got a problem with this, right?
Sure you do,
That can't
yes.
come as a surprise to you.
Yeah.
Okay. The New Yorker, okay? You, think pieces. That's you're right. You write think pieces. Why do you want to make me think about my dog? I feel about my dog, and my dog loves me back unconditionally. Why ruin that with thinking about it?
Now you know intellectually, by the way, that was me on the Colbert Show. Now you know intellect, because I had a book called What the Dog Saw. You know intellectually that that's satire. He's doing a parody of a brain-dead talk show host, but it doesn't feel like a parody when you're sitting there. He's jabbing his finger and raising his one acrobatic eyebrow, and there I am like a deer in the headlights of satire, blinking. It's terrifying. I think I went on 3 times, and every time I swore I'd never go on that show again.
You say our dogs. Do you have a dog?
I don't have a dog.
I don't have a dog. Okay.
My building doesn't allow dogs. I'm an aspirational dog owner, but I
Really?
yeah, someday.
So had you the ability, you would own a dog.
I would someday. I hope to own a dog. Yeah, I grew up with dogs, and
Were you raised by wolves? What do you mean?
grew up with dogs. That's what I mean by ambiguous. Am I in on the joke, or am I the butt of the joke? I have no idea. The Colbert Report has actually been studied by a communications scholar named Heather Lamar, who's an assistant professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. She's part of a group of social scientists who have made a specialty out of studying how humor operates in popular culture. And she was drawn to the Colbert Report for the very reason that I'm talking about, that gap between what you as the audience know intellectually that he's trying to do and the way his performance feels.
I have a lot of liberal friends, especially in academia, but I also have a lot of friends and family members that are conservative. And I started noticing that they would talk about the show as if it was equally funny, but in completely opposite ways.
It struck her as something worth examining in more detail.
Why are my Republican friends and family members watching him every single night and finding him hilarious, but they see him making fun of liberals? And my liberal friends love him to death. I'm just biggest fans ever, and think it's hilarious that he's making fun of people like Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly.
As an example, Lamar picks a clip of an interview Colbert did with the left-wing journalist Amy Goodman. This is from 2009.
Thank you so much for coming to the show.
It's good to be with you, Stephen.
Now, you're a communist, right? You're super liberal lefty. They don't get any more liberal lefty like outside agitator than you, do they?
I don't know. I think that conservative and liberal lines are breaking down right now.
Yeah, to right and wrong.
Let me talk about the reddest state
I'm not
in the
going to
nation.
let you do anything. You're going to have to earn every inch of this interview, young lady. You don't come into my house and get me to let you do anything.
During that outburst, Goodman nervously swivels back and forth in her chair. She starts to smile, but only gets halfway, so there's a kind of grimace left on her face. She raises her arm and points it at Colbert, but then just as quickly she takes it down. I know exactly how she feels.
I heard you were a firebrand. Well, bring it, baby.
I was just in...
Now, what does Lamar find when she studies audience reactions to a clip like that? She finds that the more liberal you are, the more you see Stephen Colbert as a liberal skewing conservatives. But the more conservative you are, the more you see Stephen Colbert as a conservative skewing liberals.
So essentially, they saw what they wanted to see. So the big takeaway here of this study was that this is what we would call motivated cognition or biased perception.
Colbert says to Goodman, "You're a communist." That's funny if you think the joke is on Colbert. It's also funny if you think that Goodman actually is a kind of communist, and someone is finally calling her out on it.
Yeah, and he's sticking it to a communist. And we asked those kinds of questions in several different ways. And every single time the conservatives, and especially the strong conservatives, would say, yeah, it's a joke, but he really kind of means it. So he really does sort of think she's a communist, and he really does sort of think there is a right and a wrong, and I agree with that. Whereas the liberal would be like, oh yeah, he's clearly making fun of Bill O'Reilly.
There's no difference in how funny conservatives and liberals find
Right.
Colbert.
And that's part of the magic, right? So that's why I would say he was a comedic genius.
Lamar loves Colbert, and she thinks that what he accomplished with the Colbert Report was extraordinary. He created a character who managed to appeal to all sides of the political spectrum simultaneously. Do you know how hard that is? Really, really hard. But if you think that he's somehow winning an ideological battle, you're wrong.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played
songs that made the hit parade.
Guys like us, we had it made. Those were the days.
And you knew where you were then.
Girls were girls and men were men.
Still screeching going on. This isn't the first time this has happened with politically motivated comedy, by the way. Almost 50 years ago, when Norman Lear's All in the Family was the most popular show on American television, there was a huge debate over the show's star character, the bigoted, reactionary Archie Bunker.
Isn't anybody else interested in upholding standards? Our world is coming crumbling down. The coons are coming.
Bunker was created to satirize conservative attitudes on race and sexuality. But in the end, the consensus among social scientists seemed to be that he didn't do that at all. Here's the conclusion of the best-known study on the show. We found that many persons did not see the program as a satire on bigotry. All such findings seem to suggest that the program is more likely reinforcing prejudice and racism than combating it. It didn't change any minds. And the same thing happens with loads of money. At one point, Enfield does a benefit for British nurses, who are all on strike. Nurses in the UK are public sector employees, and they want a modest raise. And Thatcher, who's intent on shrinking the size of the public sector, won't give it to them. So at this benefit, Enfield comes on stage as loads of money in his white trainers and his acid wash jeans and nylon shell, and screams at all the nurses, "Get back to work, you scum!" Then he burns a 10-pound note on stage, and the room of nurses goes wild. They love it. He's perfectly captured what they're up against. But the other side, the side they're up against, they love it too.
And it got sort of taken on by The Sun, which was a very right-wing paper, and the kind of left-wing papers. Basically, everyone took it on. Everyone decided it was theirs. You know, they made him their property.
So The Sun looked on Loads of Money quite affectionately.
Yeah, they thought it was great. And it was a sign of Thatcher's Britain that all working class people were getting richer. That was the propaganda. That was how they interpreted it, I guess. Yeah. Which obviously wasn't really the case, but it was quite funny.
Were you taken by surprise by the reception that Loads of Money got?
I was.
Why?
Well, just because, I'd done other characters and they'd been all right, but this seemed to go very big. And it got sort of mentioned in Parliament, and then Mrs. Thatcher suddenly said, we've got a loads of money economy or something. And then the leader of the opposition said, you've created this loads of money. They were both using it. One of them was using it with pride and the other one with, contempt. And it was odd, very odd. I didn't expect it at all, Malcolm.
It really is odd. There are cultural histories written of the Thatcher years, and invariably they talk about loads of money and how the character was this great symbol of the era. And it's clear that enthusiasm for this grotesque mockery was even greater on the right than it was on the left. Finally, Enfield just kind of gives up. Tell me how you killed him off.
Oh, I think I just stopped doing him, and then we were doing comic relief over here, and I think we did a sketch where he got run over. He was run over by a van on live telly for charity.
The loads of money problem happens because satire is complicated. It's not like straightforward speech that's easy to decode. It requires interpretation. That's what draws you in. That's where the humor lies. But that act of interpretation has a cost. Heather Lamar calls this the paradox of satire.
So the trade-off with satire becomes all of the thinking, or a lot of the thinking, becomes devoted to what the comic means, who the target of the joke is. And as they interpret that, then they spend less time thinking about whether that warrants any kind of real consideration or counter-arguing sort of the merits of that message.
This doesn't happen when you listen to straightforward discussion of politics. There you just think about the arguments. But satire's different.
Here, you're spending all of your time thinking about the nature of the comedy, which leaves very little mental resources available to think about whether the comedy has truth.
There's a brilliant essay written on this very subject in the July 2013 London Review of Books. It's called Sinking, Giggling into the Sea, and it's by the writer Jonathan Coe. You should read it. Coe takes the argument against satire one step further. He says the effectiveness of satire is not just undermined by its complicated nature, by its ambiguity. Coe says it's undermined by something else, the laughter it creates.
Laughter, in a way, is a kind of last resort. If you're up against a problem which is completely intractable, if you're up against a situation for which there is no human solution and never will be, then okay, let's laugh about it.
In, say, The Humor of Laurel and Hardy, Coe says that kind of laughing is perfectly appropriate.
Because when you see them taking on some ridiculous Sisyphean task like pushing a piano up an endless flight of stairs, failing time and time again, you have Oliver Hardy collapsed on the floor with the debris of the accident around him, looking resignedly to camera. Then, what they're asking you to laugh at there is the human condition and the intractability of the forces of nature and the forces of physics, which we can do nothing about. So, of course, we have to laugh. With political problems, it's slightly different. I mean, some political problems are intractable, but some political problems can be solved, and perhaps instead of laughing about them, we should try and do something about them.
And I just hope that tonight the lamestream media won't twist my words by repeating them verbatim.
Back at the beginning, I mentioned Tina Fey's brilliant impersonation of Sarah Palin on Saturday Night Live. I love those sketches. I think Tina Fey is a comic genius. But after listening to Heather Lamar and Jonathan Coe, I can't help but think that her comic genius is actually a problem. Saturday Night Live brought Tina Fey in to skewer Palin out of a sense of outrage that someone this unqualified was running for higher office. In 2008, lots of people felt this way. Palin was the running mate of John McCain, an elderly senator of uncertain health. She could easily have been president. Saturday Night Live was trying to hold Sarah Palin to some kind of scrutiny, to say, this is who she is. But looking back now, I don't think it worked, because Tina Fey is too busy being funny.
Well, here we go. This is going to be very nice. Our first guest is a terrifically funny and talented woman, and her television series 30 Rock begins its third season on October 30th. Please welcome the lovely Tina Fey, ladies and gentlemen.
In October 2008, just before the election, Tina Fey does an interview with the talk show host David Letterman. Now, you would think, with the vote looming, Faye and Letterman would want to talk about the subject of her satire or the intention of her satire. The fact that someone this unqualified might be less than a month away from the vice presidency. But they don't. They talk entirely about the mechanics of Faye's satire.
She's got that crazy accent. It's a little bit Fargo. It's a little bit Reese Witherspoon in Election. And it also, I tried to base it on my friend Paula's grandma, because her grandma was this sweet, sweet old lady from Joliet, Illinois. And she would always say, like, oh, this and that and stuff like that. And if you call up looking for Paula, she'd be like, oh, no, Paula's sleeping. No, I can't wake her. She's sleeping. And I think that might be our next vice president. Oh, no.
But it sounded to me a little, and I don't know what the connection would be, it sounds a little like Upper Midwest, kind of Great Lakes region.
Yeah, she's dropping the G's, you know, and she also, I asked Seth Meyers, this is the guy who really writes all those sketches we've been doing, and so I said, can you put a lot of R's in there? Because she gets her R's, or she really loves, the, you know, like these terrorists and William Ayers, and she digs into those R's. I think she thinks there's oil in those R's. She is digging deep.
They want the laugh, so they make fun of the way Sarah Palin talks, and the way she talks is not the problem.
There's certainly been a strange reaction to it, and then I've seen people who say, oh no, you're helping them because it seems makes her seem nice, or you know, or the Republicans say it's sexist.
Sexist? How could it be sexist?
There was some lady from the McCain campaign that there's some lady, I'm still talking like there was some lady who tried to say, you know, it was sexist. The one with teenage was sexist. I said, that's, you know, just crazy, because you have to be able to goof on the female politicians just as much. Otherwise, you really are treating them like they're weaker or something. And this Sarah Palin is a tough lady. She kills things. She kills animals that are like bigger than me and you together.
Did you catch that? Because you have to be able to goof on female politicians. Goof. Like the role of the satirist is to sit on the front porch and crack wise. Why doesn't Tina Fey just come out and admit that her satire is completely toothless? And then what happens? The very next day, the day after Tina Fey goes on Letterman, Sarah Palin appears as a guest on Saturday Night Live, right beside Tina Fey.
Thank you. Now, I'm not going to take any of your questions, but I do want to take this opportunity to say, live from New York, it's Saturday night!
They let Sarah Palin in on the joke. And Palin and Tina Fey dress up in identical outfits, red outfits, with little things in their hair, and put on identical glasses, because that's even funnier. And what you're left with, what are you left with? You're left with one of the most charming and winning and hilarious comics of her generation, letting her charisma wash over her ostensible target, disarming us, disarming Sarah Palin.
And now I'd like to entertain everybody with some fancy pageant walking.
I really wish that had been you.
Yeah, Lauren, you know, I just didn't think it was a realistic depiction of the way my press conferences would have gone.
Yes, but it's obviously a heightened reality.
Why couldn't we have done the 30 Rock sketch that I wrote?
Honestly, not enough people know that show.
Sure, we all laughed at that sketch, but it's kind of heartbreaking, isn't it? At least Harry Enfield was trying to take a bite out of the establishment with loads of money. Saturday Night Live has taken out its dentures and is sipping the political situation through a straw. Lord help us if there's some other, even less qualified and more frightening political figure out there.
I think the pleasure that laughter generates can be deceptive. To make an audience laugh is a very solid, a very tangible thing. I think it's only after the event, maybe years after the event, that you pull back and ask yourself, well, was that the effect that I wanted?
That's the writer Jonathan Coe again. He brings up Peter Cook, the legendary English comedian of the 1960s. Cook was the driving force behind Beyond the Fringe, the British satirical revue that's really the spiritual ancestor of shows like Saturday Night Live.
Of course they're not English, they're American. Now, what I mean is they're not English, they're not of English stock. I mean, you only have to look at the names. Lefkowitz, Ribblewitz, Vaseline, those aren't English names.
There used to be.
No, they never were.
I mean, there used to be very good English stock there, Anglo-Saxons.
Puritan.
Exactly, as to Statue of Liberty. And stuff.
Cook later started a comedy club in Soho in London called The Establishment.
Peter Cook, kind of his genius and also his curse was that he saw all these contradictions as soon as he started, really, and he was under no illusions that he was going to change the world through satire. And yes, the parallel he used with The Establishment was that he was modelling it all on all those wonderful Berlin cabarets from the 1920s, which had done so much to prevent the rise of Hitler and the beginnings of Nazism. Yeah.
We're going to stop there and talk a little bit about the dilemma of political satire, and then I'll finish up with the conclusion. Do you buy it, Virginia?
Are you sold? I think political satire doesn't work on the left, and it works very well on the right. I think it's a fundamentally conservative form, and I think the way all your satirists used it is conservative, and I'll tell you what I mean. The satire, unlike other forms of humor, works well against a backdrop of absolute consensus about values. So it's anti-pretension, it's anti-aspiration, it's anti-ambition. So capitalism is the perfect thing to satirize, but in that way, Margaret Thatcher, and this is in the Loads of Money satire, in that way, Margaret Thatcher was very progressive. She wanted to move England out of its old ways and promote class mobility. And the satire ended up being this quite sneering attack on the vulgar pretensions of an auto mechanic who has the audacity to get rich, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is exactly the way satire has always worked. You love it when I get academic and open myself up to satire, but satire is an 18th century form. It's Pope and Dryden saying, look at these like foolish English people with their pretensions. We know the truth, and we can get right down to it. And another academic article that came to mind is about All in the Family. Archie Bunker, Paul Damon, this French critic, called him the arch debunker. Archie Bunker existed not to satirize the right or the left, but to get to the truth, to debunk all these truths. When Stephen Colbert asks you, why do you want me to think about a dog? I just want to feel something for my dog. That's not a right or left position. That's true enough. A lot of us who write think pieces get told sometimes we're overthinking, and sometimes worry we are. And there's nothing in that attack that is anything but, let's get down to brass tacks here. You're a pointy-headed New Yorker think piece person. Let's get real. Yeah. And it works that way. It works to get real. I'll tell you one last thing. Yeah. When I grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire, where Dartmouth College is, Stephen Colbert's character went to Dartmouth College, notoriously conservative college with a satire sheet that was very attractive and interesting to me when I was in high school. In the middle of the green were sitting people in the late 80s protesting investment in South Africa with these shanties that they had organized. I thought that was very romantic. They slept outside in shanty towns in deference to the political situation in South Africa. They were complaining the college was invested in, they wanted them out. The Dartmouth Review, this right-wing journal, managed to find all their pretensions, how they brought moisturizer to the place, or how they, needed, I'm trying to think of like 80s totems, but how one of them also, took time out to go hear Madonna in concert or whatever. And it was the typical satire of political correctness. These were rich kids doing this thing. So one night, they tore down the shanties and sold the wood as firewood to the poor. Gave it to the poor. Mm. So in other words, we have real values, and you're all pretension. Yeah. And at the time, I thought, why is the left so unfunny? The left has none of this room. I mean, we don't see it now. And then there are all these ways that you could do a right-wing satire of Donald Trump. Sometimes Twitch does this, the video game site. They'll say things about Melania Trump that Saturday Night Live won't say. They'll just be like mail order, mail order, mail order in their video thing when she comes up. Because that's the kind of I'm going to speak truth to this thing. But the left can't do that. The left can't just suddenly go for, these bald, I'm going to speak the truth about these people, because that's not the style of the left. So anyway, tell me if you think, if you can give me an example of the way that it hasn't worked for the right. And I think Stephen Colbert is fundamentally conservative.
Well, I would say, there are many things to respond to that. I guess what I'm objecting to is people who adopt the satirical pose and then sell out.
Yep.
So Saturday Night Live, a lot of things you're discussing are the kind of satire that happens on the fringes of the culture.
Yep.
And I agree that it can be very effective. But our mainstream organs of satire, it strikes me, are toothless, like I said. Saturday Night Live's a joke. You would think at this cultural moment, Saturday Night Live would be leading the charge. Mm-hmm. And they don't. They invite the object of their scrutiny on the show. And I mean, and it's that lack of, it's their desire to be liked, which is essentially why you tell a joke. You want to be liked. Trumps their desire to tell the truth. And that's what I'm objecting to. They're trying to defend their place in culture and not perform their role as satirists. They are conservative in the sense that they are way too worried about their own status and not worried enough about.
Yeah.
And that I find that kind of cowardice to be, maybe it's too strong a word, but it's sort of appalling.
You know, maybe I think we might be saying the same thing, because I think that, like, the satire of Sarah Palin is classist and sexist and absurd. Like, you know, just because she says this and that, like, all our grandmothers have filler. You know, Tina Fey hates grammatical mistakes and regional accents. Like, you know, I'm not sure that qualifies as an attack on her as a possible higher office holder.
And that little clip she does with Letterman when she's talking about the R's and they're trying to place the accent, that you can just imagine that completely backfiring.
Yeah.
That is fodder for people to like Sarah Palin because she's being kind of made fun of in this sort of sneering.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it fails as its intent is to try and show us the truth about this woman, but by choosing the completely wrong strategy, it fails as anyway. I think the last part of my show is an attempt to describe a case where I think satire actually works, and I think it resolves both of our our questions. Okay, so I'm going to finish up. Then we'll take questions from you guys. There's a television show in Israel called A Wonderful Country. Eretz Nederet. Someone here knows Hebrew. Nederet, that's it. It's been on the air since 2003. It's satire, very political. The show's writers belong to the beleaguered Israeli political left. They want a separate state for Palestinians. They want an end to the endless wars. They worry about the increasing religious conservative influence on the country's politics. They're ideologically motivated in their humor in the same way that Harry Enfield and Tina Fey were. But there's a difference.
It's more political, and it's a little more rugged and hardcore, because life in Israel is much more rugged and hardcore.
That's Muli Segev, the show's executive producer. A Wonderful Country airs Friday night at 9, after the news. Practically the whole country watches it.
The stomach of Israeli viewers is much more adjustable. You know, they can adjust to much tougher material. Firstly, because the news broadcast that is on the air before us shows so many gruesome stuff and horrible things that naturally the comedy after that will be the same.
A Wonderful Country goes further than the kind of TV satire that we have in the US or the UK. Maybe because the stakes are so much higher in Israel. Maybe in a country with a tortured history, suffering under constant threat, the boundaries that satire needs to push up against are more real.
And we have very, very bad reactions sometimes.
Can you give me an example of a sketch that brought about a bad reaction?
Let's say like a couple of years ago after the war on Lebanon, we made a sketch that was a parody on a game show called 1 versus 100. You know that show?
1 versus 100 was a quiz show where one supposedly brilliant contestant, known as the One, squares off against 100 people sitting in little cubicles in the audience. The One and the audience are asked a question, and whenever someone in the audience gets it wrong, they're eliminated. The light in their cubicle goes off, and we can't see them anymore. In A Wonderful Country's version, the One was the prime minister at the time, and the audience was made up of 119 people. 119 was the number of Israeli soldiers who died in the 2006 Lebanon war.
He was asked, why did you go to that war? Why did you do that? Why did you do that? And all the answers he gave were wrong, naturally.
It was the 1 versus the 119. And with every wrong answer from the prime minister, the light went off underneath one of the soldiers in the audience. They vanished from sight.
A soldier went dead on the board, and they were physically there. Okay, so the light went off on their spot, and that was very graphic and very hard to watch. But it was important for us to say so, that this war was unnecessary at the time.
Can you imagine Saturday Night Live doing that sketch during the Iraq War? Of course not. I think we've forgotten what real satire is in the West. That's real satire. It uses a comic pretense to land a massive blow. The first A Wonderful Country sketch I ever saw was from 5 years ago. It was done right at the time when liberal Israelis began to despair about the direction of their government under Benjamin Netanyahu. The sketch I saw is styled in the manner of a government-funded documentary, a kind of promotional video for a new educational initiative in the schools. It's set in a classroom full of adorable kindergarten students, seriously adorable. A warm and very compelling teacher is at the front of the room.
היום ילדים אנחנו נדבר על המילה שלום. מי יכול להגיד לי מה צריך כדי לעשות שלום?
איזה שלום? עם מי נעשה שלום? אין בכלל עם מי לדבר שם.
נכון לי, אלי, אין עם מי לדבר שם.
The teacher says, "Today, kids, we will talk about peace. Who can tell me what we need to have peace?" Then the kids start to mouth every cliche that the Israeli right wing uses to justify not negotiating with the Palestinians, imposing a two-state solution, or ignoring world opinion and continuing to build settlements in the occupied territories. A truly cute girl with curly hair says, "What peace? Who will we make peace with? There's not even anyone to talk to on the other side." The teacher replies, "That's right, Lolly, there's no one to talk to." Another adorable girl says, "I used to be a lefty, but then I got disillusioned." The teacher asks, "So why is the world angry at us?" A little boy says, "Our problem is PR." And then he repeats it. The teacher turns to the camera. "We don't want them to grow up ignorant. We teach them geography from a young age." She points to Israel on a globe. "Here is our tiny little Israel in the Middle East. Who knows what we call the whole rest of the world?" And the children chant in unison, "Anti-Semitic." It's hard to explain a comedy sketch if I can't show it to you, though you can go and see this on revisionisthistory.com. And it's doubly difficult when it's comedy from another country. But believe me when I say the comedy bit is hilarious. I laughed out loud.
The current Israeli state of mind, when there is no chance for peace, you can't rely on any agreement with the Arabs because they'll break it. The criticism from the world is anti-Semitism and not legitimate criticism. We try to put it in this situation where kids in kindergarten are learning it, and you see how bleak it is, how sad it is to raise a generation with no hope. And that's exactly the ideology of Netanyahu. Things are only going to get worse. All the world is against us. We're alone in the world. We have to build a fortress around us and pray for God to save us. It's not in our hand. There's nothing we can do. And that's it for the rest of your life, kids.
I said I laughed out loud the first time I saw that sketch, but the second time I saw it, I didn't laugh at all.
That's what we're aiming for in a lot of our sketches. It appears to be funny, and then it sinks in, and you think about it once more, and then maybe something will touch you, and you feel the pain that, driven us to write that. The fundamental truth, when you think about it, is kind of sad.
Can someone read this sketch the wrong way, like Stephen Colbert got read the wrong way? Could some viewers think the sketch satirizes left-wing Israeli thinking? Maybe, but I think the intentions are pretty plain. They're not hard to decode. We have children mouthing the absurd dead-end arguments of adults. And if laughter is normally the great distractor, the laughter dissipates awfully quickly here. Satire works best when the satirist has the courage not just to go for the joke.
אתם רוצים שנשחק בשלא יטיפו לנו מוסר? איטלקים. חברו לנאצים בשואה.
The teacher says, do you want to play Nobody Gets to Preach to Us About Morality? The kids shout out, yes, yes. The teacher pulls out a tambourine and starts chanting. The Italians. One little girl chants back. They collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust. The teacher chants, the French. A child replies, Vichy regime. Teacher, the Turks massacred the Armenians. Teacher, Norwegians. And the kids say, killed all the salmon. Teacher, so what do we tell the world? Kids in unison, don't preach to us about morals. The kids are waving their fists in the air at this point, shouting in unison. There's courage in that sketch. Unlike Saturday Night Live on Sarah Palin, which is comedy done with no courage at all. If there's a lesson to the 10 episodes of this first season of Revisionist History, it's this, that nothing of consequence gets accomplished without courage. You can't educate the poor without making difficult choices, without giving up some portion of your own privilege. You can't be a great basketball player without being willing to look stupid. You can't even drive a car properly unless you're willing to acknowledge that you sometimes make mistakes, stupid, involuntary, dumb mistakes. The path to a better world is hard. Is that depressing? I don't think so. I think what's depressing is when we ignore everything history is trying to tell us.
Hi, first, love the podcast. It's great. My question's about the three sort of episodes on education. So my question is, what concerns you the most about how education functions in the U.S., from pre-K to grad school? Just what worries you about the trajectory the country's on?
Yeah. Wow, that's a long answer. Well, if you listen to those three episodes, you know that I'm not particularly happy with any portion of the American educational system. Mostly it's the misallocation of resources. I don't understand why, if you total up the combined endowments of the 8 Ivy League schools and Stanford is $140 billion. They collectively educate 11,000 low-income students. $140 billion for 11,000 low-income students. If you think that is a reasonable ratio, then I can't help you. I think that's obscene. And you can't solve any of the problems around higher education in this country unless you liberate that money and put it to use. Right now it's sitting in the coffers of hedge funds, generating tax-free interest for those institutions so they can plant tulips in the flower bed. I mean, I just don't understand why people aren't jumping up and down and saying this is wrong. And then I could go from there. But I mean, I would start with the fact that there is a gross inequity in the way dollars are distributed in the system.
How, when you were producing this, how was this different from writing when you were expressing yourself? The way you think about things, the way you want to articulate it. What was your biggest challenge and revelation?
Well, I get to rant in a podcast in a way you don't in writing. I'm being slightly facetious. It's such a natural vehicle for emotion that you can tell a story in a very different way. I suppose there's more, I sort of get why radio is the way radio is, why there's so much emotional extremity in radio, because it's just so easy to communicate strong feelings. And, many of the topics that I chose were topics about which I have strong feelings. And that I wouldn't say that's true necessarily of my writing. I often write about things that to which I have a much kind of more ambivalent relationship. So you're getting angry, Malcolm, now.
What would make you think that, a Fortune 50 for-profit corporation that stands behind Saturday Night Live would ever take somewhat of an edgy, deep, thoughtful, satirical attack? And, I think about maybe Spitting Image that was done by a government-owned broadcaster might want to do that, but I just can't think of anything outside of maybe the Richard Pryor show where any major network ever really took a deep, biting, satirical line.
No, you're absolutely right, which is why we should all cheer the demise of the networks. It's crazy to have a system where everything is being channeled through three large institutions that have only, whose interest is primarily their own bank account. You're never going to get courageous voices. So God bless the internet age where we can have 1,000 different voices and people can have the freedom to speak their mind. Because as far as I'm concerned, institutions like Saturday Night Live have abandoned or maybe they never even had any real pretensions to truth-telling.
Thank you, Malcolm. My name is Jeremiah. I go to one of the Ivy League institutions. And what we find is that, exactly right, the problem of misallocation. So I wanted to ask you a question about how do you capitalize on that talent once you get there? Because your audience, you speak to the people who are writing the checks. They're the alumni who want to give back, but they don't know how to do it. And the best case scenario is that Pablo, from Pablo Doesn't Remember, is able to go to a school. Then when Pablo goes to the school, he finds out that all of the money that $100 million from alumni gave, he doesn't see any of it. So I wanted to ask you, what is your recommendation for the person who really feels and they really want to care about the issues, but they don't really know what the next step to do is?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess... the intent of some of those shows was to encourage a kind of thoughtful philanthropy. That you should ask yourself the question: where can my philanthropic dollars go furthest? And also, I would say that I think that we should spend a lot less time at this end of the educational spectrum, and a lot more time on this end of the educational spectrum. We should be broadening the base. We shouldn't be perfecting the tip. I mean, we have sharpened the end of the pencil so many times in this country, and to such, I mean, it is just about perfect. And at the same time, the other end is, relatively speaking, neglected. So I would I would just say we have to kind of reorient ourselves to what we. This is. If I might back up, there's something very particularly American about this. If you're not American, the most striking thing about American life is how extraordinarily elitist it is. And I don't mean elitist in the typical sense of that word. I mean that Americans are really, really, really interested in the 95th percentile. They're in love with it. You talk to people about hospitals and they will say, Sloan Kettering is the greatest cancer hospital in America. Well, okay, maybe that's true, but Sloan Kettering can only treat 0.005% of the cancer patients in America. Why are you obsessing about Sloan Kettering when 99.95% of Americans can go nowhere near it? Why aren't you concerned about the cancer center that's in the middle of Iowa, right? In a place like Canada, the argument's completely different. Canadians, perhaps to a fault, obsess about the hospital in the middle of nowhere, right? Canadians are all about the 55th percentile. But there's this weird infatuation with this country where all the ink goes to the very, very best. I'll give you a small illustration of this since this is Olympic season. When I was a kid, Greg Joy, an obscure Canadian high jumper, won the silver medal at the Olympics. And you would have thought that Jesus had come back for the second coming. We just couldn't imagine a better outcome. And in America, if you win a silver medal, people think that you failed. And they say, what happened? Never occurred to us. We just thought, good Lord, a silver medal, right? Only beaten by one guy. This is like, and I kind of wish that this country was more interested in even people who made the final, right? As opposed to this endless worship of the very, very, very tip.
What was the thought behind calling it revisionist history? And do you feel like it's an accurate title?
Well, I'll give you a short, as I like to do, a discursive answer to that question. And I'll once again invoke my Canadianness. If you are from a small, beleaguered country to the north of a large bully, you're used to the notion that history is written by the victors is old hat to you. Like every Canadian knows this. You know, the history I was taught in school about the War of Independence is completely different from the history you were taught, right? You guys are taught something that, as far as I'm concerned, bears no relationship to what actually happened. You know, I won't even start to enumerate the lies that you learned. Why you taught lies about what happened in 1776? Because you won, right? We lost. And so what do we have? We have only the truth on our side at this point. So I am, any Canadian, or it's funny, my mom is Jamaican, an even lesser, more insignificant country that loses all the time. So like I'm sort of used to this notion that history's wrong all the time. And you have to, the only way you're ever going to get it back at the truth is if you're willing to go back and overturn a lot of assumptions and beliefs about what people think actually occurred. And if you won, you have no motivation to do that, right? Why does anyone who's an American have any motivation to go back and re-examine what actually happened in 1776? You don't, right? Why do you have any motivation to go back and to discover, as we were taught in school, that America was freeloading on the British taxpayer? People like my ancestors were paying for you guys, right? And you chose to kind of twist the truth because you could, because you wrote the history books afterwards. So like that's a slightly, I'm making fun of you, but that happens so often that I just think a good position to take is that we always get it wrong the first time. And you have an obligation as a thinking moral person to go back and put all of your beliefs to the test. And so this show is one tiny part of what I hope will be what ought to be an ongoing lifelong process for all of us.
Hi. First of all, my name's Mia, and I want to thank you so much for coming out and sharing your work. I think it's absolutely amazing. I'm a little starstruck. But so my question is that you touch a lot about it, things that are basically fact versus feelings. And I think, for instance, in The Blame Game, which is one of your most recent episodes, you talk about how so much about the Toyota crash wasn't the reality, but yet what people were feeling was actually becoming what was the effect. What you think is the most important thing to think about, whether it be really the facts behind these issues or the feelings and the emotions that the country and the world has, because sometimes that's really what actually is the defining matter behind that. So yeah, just your opinion on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I guess the question of feelings guides how you communicate with people. So what happened? The Toyota thing is really interesting. So Toyota I didn't go into this in the podcast, but Toyota completely botches how they handle sudden acceleration, because what happens is people start to report that their Corollas are mysteriously accelerating, or their Camrys are, and Toyota hears about this, and they send their engineers from Japan to come over, and they're engineers. And when they go, and they actually send them to talk to the people who are involved in these incidents, and the engineers look at the car, examine it, determine that there's nothing wrong, and say to the person, as an engineer would, you are sadly mistaken, in fact, possibly delusional. Your car is absolutely perfect. You screwed up. And how do they respond to that? Well, here they are, terrified, shaken up. They think they almost died. They heard about some story in the news about how a guy had a horrible crash and killed his entire family. And here they have an engineer say, there's nothing wrong with your car. You screwed up. I can't believe you called us. What happens to them? They won't accept the truth. They double down. They denounce Toyota. They say that there's some massive conspiracy. They imagine this whole thing about software. They make it up out of whole cloth. What Toyota took them over a year to understand was that just because people are emotional and wrong doesn't mean that you have to push their feelings aside and look down on them and sneer at them. They're not automobile engineers. They don't know how a car works. And as you say, the feeling that they have is feels true. They really did think their foot was on the brake, right? When it was on the accelerator. So that ought to have been a guide to how you communicate with them. And Toyota finally figures this out and becomes all touchy-feely. And the problem goes away, right? I mean, and that, I think, is if you're concerned, say, about a certain political candidate in 2016, the way you ought to speak to that candidate's supporters is not to sneer at them and to roll your eyes and to say you're an idiot. It is to understand where their particular kind of outrage or anger comes from and tailor your communication to them accordingly. So that's how I would say we ought to take emotion into account. One last question.
Hi. That's a great. I have listened to all your podcasts. It's great. Couple of questions. One to piggyback on the young lady. Is there, with the Toyota debacle, was there a reporting bias there? Because there weren't similar instances with GM and others, and I was just curious whether there was any answer from the automobile industry. Mm-hmm. And the second question is to do with the Stanford versus Rowan University, where you really did great with President Hennessy. And I'm just curious whether he was open enough to acknowledge that they are in the business of return of investment, ROI. You went through a labored procedure of making us understand that out of $800 million, they get 100 kids, and it's around $140,000 a year. But it seems it's deeply discounted. They are investing in the students that they think would give them, their investment back and more, like Google and others. Mm-hmm. Whereas Rowan is not looking that way. It's looking as a community, and they're not looking at the students who graduate, bringing back the same kind of ROI at a personal level, at a university level. And I just want to know your thoughts and whether you had an opportunity to ask that question.
Yeah. Well, to answer the second question first, those of you who've listened to that episode where I interview the president of Stanford, I remain deeply baffled by his point of view. So to summarize it as best I can, he basically was saying, well, we need to start an $800 million scholarship fund at Stanford to bring in 100 students a year because we think that by bringing in very, very bright students and supporting them with lots and lots of money, we can change the world. To which I would say, I thought Stanford was doing that already. So is John Hennessy essentially saying that the job Stanford has done over the last 100 years in bringing in very bright students and supporting them with lots and lots of money hasn't worked, so now we have to start a second Stanford? I mean, it's a very curious position to take if you're the president of an elite institution, to say at the end of your tenure, I'm going to start another elite institution to do essentially what I was supposed to have been doing all along, right? So there's a kind of implicit, I would love to sort of put him on the couch with a skilled Freudian and have him walk through the thought process behind this kind of implicit acknowledgement that it's not working, right? The other thing I was amazed at is the kind of the extraordinary self-confidence of these people who think that they really can select, that if you look hard enough for people who have really high test scores and throw enough money at them, they will save the world. I'm still waiting for evidence that the world is saved on a routine basis by people with lots of money and high test scores. And I can't find that evidence. To my mind, the world seems to be, well, equal parts imperiled and saved by people with high test scores and lots of money. So I'm more attracted to the Rowan model, which goes back to what I was saying earlier. Rowan University is a school that's trying to broaden the base, that says, maybe we've tapped out our search for kids with really high test scores from really great high schools. Maybe we ought to extend our search to people from non-traditional places. And that strikes me as a strategy that will yield a much higher return on investment. So that would be my. No part of my conversation with John Hennessy in retrospect made any sense at all, and I have never had a conversation with someone who the world regards so highly that was so completely disappointing. As to GM, as to the automobile industry, yeah, every automobile manufacturer in the world, in America, that is to say, has sudden acceleration complaints, but they keep them quiet. And the whole time Toyota was being victimized, everybody else was just praying that no one publicized the phony cases that they get levied against them. But anyway, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the show.
This was great. Thanks a lot.